that is key. Instead, Magnus
Ah,
chooses to change the positioning of his rook. Was Nakamura aware of this possibility? Earlier, Magnus had his rook in front of his pawn, protecting it. But the problem of being in front of your pawn is that then you're kind of blocking your own pawn from becoming a new queen. So Magnus tries a maneuvering where he puts his rook to defend the pawn from the side, and now Magnus will try to get his king over to the left hand side to help his pawn become a new queen.
yeah, that's been an interesting change of the rook's position. And now Carlsen is going for this plan with f6, king g6, and then rook b4, pushing back the king. But still, I don't think, the pawn will get one rank further. Like, it will get to the fourth rank pretty easily. But I think white will try to keep their rook on the fifth rank after that, cutting off the black king. So I
I don't
still,
know. To
yeah.
me, it looks like Magnus is making some very serious progress here. If he can get his king close to these white pawns on the right hand side, that might be the game right there. So
But
Magnus right now he's pushing for the world championship title, and
but
Hikaru Nakamura going into this, I'm pretty sure he thought this was going to be a pretty easy way of making a draw. But there's nothing easy when you're defending down a pawn against Magnus Carlsen. This is what he does.
But what happens here if like black pushes the pawn to a4 and white's rook goes to a5, cutting off the black king? That seems to be a little bit of an impediment to black making progress, right? Because the pawn is
Yeah,
stuck
I don't
there.
have the arrows on the board
Hmm.
where we got up, but I agree with you that keeping the black king out is definitely going to be Hikaru's top priority. And then looking at the body language now between the two of them, it feels as though Hikaru is still very confident that he has this under control. Uh, Precisely for the reason you're giving, that Hikaru has figured out a way to stop Black's king from getting close to the remaining white pawns.
Yeah, Magnus looking like, definitely from the body language, he didn't like what was happening on the board. He was felt a little like it was a little frustrating for him. And he gave a check with the rook. The king moved up, and then he put the rook back where it was, actually behind the pawn. So not that much changed.
Well,
Um,
actually, it did
yeah.
change quite a bit, right? Because Magnus has managed to get his king higher up on the board than where it was last time. Magnus had his rook standing in front of the pawn, protecting it, but simultaneously staying in its way. And now Nakamura is trying to bring his rook in. Um, I'm not sure what he's doing with his rook, and Magnus definitely doesn't understand what Hikaru is doing with his rook because Magnus gave one of his famous faces. Nakamura now moving his rook back to where it came from. Nakamura will now try to move his rook so that it's controlling along the fifth rank.
Mm-hmm.
An idea that Irina already highlighted to stop the Black King from entering the game. And there is the key move from Hikaru. That rook is perfectly placed to stop the Black King from arriving at the scene. And now Hikaru will retreat his king back into a defensive positioning. And the big question is, will this be enough to make a draw? Hikaru Nakamura is out of the medals. The best thing he can manage now is make a draw and maybe stop Magnus Carlsen from winning gold. The one thing that is certain is that if Hikaru loses this, Magnus will be the world champion yet again.
Yeah, well, I have to tell you, a lot is going to depend on the result of this game of Torov versus Duda, which apparently now is looking not so bad for Torov, which is kind of incredible as he was um, in big trouble earlier in that rook endgame. Now it looks like it's probably going to finish in a draw, which is crazy because so Abdusattorov is definitely going to be in the tiebreak in that situation. And is it going to be Nepomniachtchi or Carlsen who is going to join him? So a
And
lot of
so
suspense in that game.
that's a big result for Carlsen in a negative way, because Abdusattorov is one of few players who definitely has better tiebreaks than Carlsen. So that game ending in a draw is very bad news for the Norwegian. He probably now needs to win this endgame to get his title. But still, when you're saying there's a turnaround for Abdusattorov, he's not going to win still, right?
No, he's definitely not going to win. Yep, they're basically in a rook and pawn endgame. What with each one having Duda having 2 pawns and Abdusattorov 1. So Abdusattorov is not going to win, but it's way better for him than it used to be, and it looks like he's within reach of a draw. And this position looks pretty drawing as well. Yeah, Naka moved his king back. Now he'll probably put it on h3, and Carlsen can't really abandon the king side pawns to bring his king over to the queen side. So it looks like this game is going to.
You're getting ahead of yourself. Magnus has not given up on this. He is of the opinion that White's king is now very cramped on the side of the board. And so using a Zugzwang technique, forcing the white rook to move away from its optimal position, Magnus is now able to infiltrate with his king. And that's causing a lot new problems for Nakamura. And once again, Nakamura's rook has to move away because he's kind of trapped his own king on the side of the board. And Nakamura chooses to go away from the black pawn. A huge decision from Nakamura here, leaving that control of the dangerous pawn on the left-hand side of the board. He's trying to make the counterattack on black's pawn, but that is a very smart strategy, actually, because if he can eliminate both of Magnus's pawns, there is no problem that Magnus maybe will get a queen on the other side. Because once the black pawns are eliminated, Hikaru will create, try to get a queen of his own on that right-hand side.
Yeah, so Carlsen decided he didn't want to give up this pawn on f5, and we expect Nakamura to just return his rook to a4. Nakamura, by the way, looks like a lot more focused than he did, a lot less relaxed, I would say, than he did a couple of moves ago. Like, he saw there were some potential problems. The game wasn't as over as he thought. Interesting, he plays rook f3. Huh.
Yes. So
that's
he's
an
deciding
square for the rook.
Yeah, he's deciding to attack the rook, the black pawn from the side. The idea being that once again, Magnus is struggling with the fact that his rook is kind of blocking his pawn's path. Magnus wants to push his pawn further forward, but cannot do so with the rook blocking. And so Hikaru has decided as long as I'm attacking the pawn, I'm doing a good job of stopping it. And Hikaru is saying it doesn't really matter where I'm attacking from. Both attacks will cause trouble for Magnus's protection scheme.
So, well, we know Hikaru needs to take the pawn on f5 now, right? So Magnus just abandoned it. And at this point...
it's Magnus's turn.
It's Magnus's... Oh, okay, sorry, yeah. Sometimes they get that mixed up. That's right. White just played rook f3. And Magnus has to decide, go back or give up the pawn. But I don't really see how giving up those pawns is going to give him anything but a headache calculating.
Well, I'm not even sure Hikaru is interested in capturing that pawn. For instance, if Magnus now tries to go with his pawn closer to with his king closer to his pawn, then Hikaru would just give tons of checks from the side, and it turns out that black's king is unable to get away from the side checks. So therefore, Magnus chose to go back towards the right-hand side instead, and he's now given up the pawn on f5, and Hikaru is going to take another pawn as well, and then get his rook into a defensive positioning. Or maybe actually he's going to move his king back now that Magnus moved his rook and no longer is trapping that king on the edge of the board.
Yeah, I mean, rook a5 is a pretty good move, but also king g2, as you said. And
Magnus gives it up. It's a draw. And now the big question is, who will play the tiebreaks for this championship title? Because we can also confirm that Abdusaturov has made a draw against Jan Krzysztof Duda. All the guys who were in the lead before this final round has made a draw, and the rules of the event stipulate that only the two players with the best tiebreak score will be allowed to play the playoff for the championship. That means we should now try to take a look at how the standings were before the round started. That is quite significant, actually, because